Welcome back. This section will be looking at ethics and the application of ethics to wearables specifically. So as we dive into this section, let's have a look first at the benefits of these new technologies in medicine. Many times I feel that when we're looking at AI and new tech and robotics, there seems to be quite a lot of negativity and fears around these technologies, but let us not forget that at the same time as there are risks certainly with these new tech, there are also many benefits. The World Health Organization estimates that there is a current shortage worldwide of around 4.3 million physicians, nurses, and allied health workers. And this really brings into focus some of the ways that new technology, robotics, and AI could help take the load in terms of healthcare and bring people more access. The World Health Organization also created predictive models, and they found that in the year 2030 that there would be a shortage in those same healthcare workers by 18 million people across the globe. So if you'd like to have a look at this study, you can have a look. It's called Global Strategy on Human Resources for Health, Workforce 2020. And as you can see on your screen now, there are differences across the world, obviously, in the need and how many people are running short in terms of the human resources and health. But while we're looking at that in terms of, the projections, we see that the need for healthcare services is actually rising. So as a quote, civilizational diseases such as diabetes and obesity are on the rise, while aging societies need more and more care. So we're going to have a very brief look at these benefits of technologies. I'm not going to go into great detail on each one of them. But the first one that I'd like to point out is just improvements in health institution efficiency. Now, if you think back to the section where I was introducing AI, I spoke to you about systems efficiencies. And here we see that using health AI could actually vastly improve the way our health organizations are run and managed. Remember that there was that paper where Atomwise looked for new molecules for Ebola. Now, this brings to the forefront the dramatic increase in the rate of research and development, and potentially also the decrease in cost. In terms of care, we see that health professionals themselves could make use of AI knowledge and technology to improve their treatment plans. And of course, there's also the personalization of medicine, or semi-personalization of medicine with population genetics and various developments within the omics technologies. So your genomics and proteomics and other small molecule technologies that could increase the personalization of medicine. With these improvements in medical technology in general, we would obviously see a better access in terms of people's health outcomes improving and therefore their visits decreasing. So the burden of disease on the public health system actually coming down. Obviously, I think for a lot of healthcare workers, there is a great burden within the job of these repetitive tasks or administrative tasks. And I think many healthcare providers would like to see less of that so that they could focus more on what they're there to achieve with the patient, which is improving their standard of care. Treatment adherence is pretty interesting as well. I haven't really touched on it in this presentation, but there are digital pills, for example, or other types of AI technologies and robotics care technologies which can improve patient adherence to treatments in the elderly or those who are mentally ill. The one that I've outlined here is the improvements in distributive justice. So from an ethics point of view, we'd like to see more people accessing better standard of care in health across the globe. And that was the one that I really wanted to highlight to you. In terms of moral problems, now that we've looked at the benefits, we see that in the digital age, generally speaking, there are a couple of issues, and those include privacy of data, personal data, demographic data, health data, etc. But really, generally speaking, in the digital age, privacy of data is a tremendous problem to new technology providers. Then we see copyright as well. So intellectual property rights and copyright are somewhat of a challenge in the digital age. What does it actually mean to create something new? Is there anything new? Is everything that we create just influenced by one another? And how do we deal with this in terms of new developments in technology? And of course, there are the security concerns where data could be accessed by third parties who may have evil intentions. When we look at advanced AI, remember that I spoke to you about general AI and superhuman AI. We start to think about moral problems. One of them is what we ought to code into the AI so that it mimics human ethics, because obviously some of our ethical approaches could actually be codified and inputted into AI so that they actually mimic the ability to make moral decisions. And in addition to that, they also mimic human emotions, where they could, for instance, mimic empathy. Should AI that deal with patients always be coded with empathy? How would that look? And what would it mean for that interaction with the patient? But looking at super advanced AI, there are also other philosophical issues. And when I say the word issues, I don't mean to sound negative about it at all. What I'm saying is that they are challenges to the philosophy community. Things like free will. What is the true nature of free will? And if a super advanced AI, or even a highly advanced deep learning AI algorithm, mimics so many human emotions and reactions, and the ability to make advanced decisions, does that AI have a kind of free will? And looking at personhood, what does it mean to be a person? Already, personhood is such an important concept in ethics. It has a wide-ranging impact on many moral problems. And when it comes to artificial intelligence, we are asking questions about the personhood of a moral machine, so to speak. And then that's related to self-determinism, especially when it comes to robotics, because robots can move on their own. They're actors in the world, where they are able to seemingly make independent decisions, and many of those decisions that a robot would make, a robot carrying this intelligent mind, this AI mind, can take actions in the world. And when we look at that robot, we might see a self-determining being. And of course, the questions of responsibility and that I have already touched on in this presentation. And lastly, consciousness, the question of consciousness, and at what points does a moral machine, which is mimicking the human experience, does that machine become conscious? What is consciousness? Do we as humans possess consciousness? So those are the kinds of philosophical questions that are going on in the community. Within ethics, we address these moral problems systematically and logically. By its very nature, the study of ethics attempts to criticize and examine all beliefs, and students of ethics ought to be empowered to give reasoned answers to why and what when it comes to moral actions and beliefs. I put this sentence in because I would really like um, to bring across this understanding that there is a right and a wrong answer. Many times I encounter people who say to me that ethics is kind of pointless because there's no right answer. You can give any answer and it could be right. And that's kind of a misunderstanding of what ethics is trying to achieve. Ethics is a branch of philosophy, and philosophy is critically minded in terms of its approach. It's quite formulaic, really. There are premises. Those premises equal conclusions. You can make critical thinking errors. You can strengthen your arguments and you learn how to argue correctly. And that all comes into ethics. Ethics is about reasoning, particularly and of course especially in the Western world. That is what ethics is all about. So the ethics theories that underpin the study of ethics are vast. There are many of them, but just some of them that are typically used in Western philosophy and in medical ethics are virtue ethics, deontology or rules-based ethics, utilitarianism or the maximizing the greatest happiness for all, and then also justice, the theory of justice, and justice is fairness. It's way beyond the scope of this presentation to go into these. I've created another presentation on fundamentals, and in that presentation I take you quite deeply into these theories. But what I'd like you to focus on and to continue to read up on is the fact that these theories help you to create an argument around your approaches to these moral problems that I've put forward to you this morning. Secondly, in medicine specifically, we have an approach to moral problems which is called principlism. And there are four main principles that guide healthcare: the respect for patient autonomy, beneficence or doing good for patients, non-maleficence or obviously doing no harm to patients, and justice. Again, I have created a fundamentals course just on these four principles and an approach that I put forward, a framework rather, where if you do encounter an ethical dilemma in your workday, that you can follow this framework that I've put forward, and I've given you specific questions you can ask that relate back to each of these principles. The principle I am focusing in on today is the principle of respect for patient autonomy. The respect for patient autonomy principle is the principle that really underpins things like patient privacy, patient confidentiality, and the importance of attaining patient consent in healthcare and in research. So I'd like to look at informed consent and the user agreements that we encounter when we use new technology products. So many times when we use these products, they come with this very tedious, long document, which is referred to as a user agreement. And this is a contract. When you use that technology, just many of you may have access to a fitness watch or a sports watch. When you upload the app on your smartphone or your computer, when it starts up, it says, you need to agree to the terms of use and the privacy terms. So you are prompted to agree to that. When it comes to those types of products, there's sort of a blurred line because these products, and obviously the products that I've exposed you to in the seminar, both of these have implications for health, and they're used by the patient in a context of healthcare. And for that reason, we would expect and hope that the patient could also be protected by consent in the ethics sense. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go into a couple of slides, and then we'll shortly be closing this part of the lecture. And I've contrasted for you the difference between the thinking and the approach when it comes to user agreement, and then on the other side, the ideals of a patient-doctor informed consent process. On the left with the user agreement, I've referenced Klugman 2018 because I'm obviously no lawyer. So, you know, in terms of what a user agreement typically entails is on the left. Firstly, I just want to mention that I have said this before in this talk previously, that the person who is agreeing is seen as or considered to be a consumer. Whereas when we look at a person in the healthcare setting, we see them as a patient. In the user agreement, the patient registers, but she is prompted to indicate agreement. So there is a button that says agree or I agree. That is a prompt to agree. But in informed consent, there's no such thing. The patient may agree or disagree. One of the most important cornerstones of consent is that a person should always be able to refuse. Consent is one side of the coin, refusal is the other side. It is critically important. If that person may not refuse, then by nature there is no consent in that situation, in that scenario. So obviously the user agreement, as I've said, is usually a very long agreement. Just out of curiosity, the Apple iTunes, and there's a similar one with Fitbits, is 56 pages long. So I don't know about you guys, but I don't actually know of anybody who has read that agreement. And I must admit, I haven't read it myself. So these tedious documents and the way that they're laid out obviously could be improved, but the nature of those documents make them really difficult to read. But in informed consent, you know, the doctor or the healthcare provider has a positive duty to enhance patient understanding. So it's argued within ethics that aside from just giving them the ability to agree or disagree, it's actually about really educating that patient, because you're promoting their autonomy. You're improving their autonomy by educating them. And by them having obviously a reasonable standard of understanding the procedure. We cannot reasonably get the patient to understand it as much as you understand it, but we can take them to a reasonable degree of understanding where they're actually giving a genuine consent. So a user agreement is essentially a contract of adhesion. What that means is that the user is not really able to negotiate the terms of the contract. They simply need to agree to using it. And if they don't agree, then they don't get to use the technology, because the contracts are set up in such a way that it's an all or nothing situation. Whereas with informed consent, it's not really like that. You know, the healthcare professional dialogues with the patients. they help them to understand various options. I mean, the patient can even go for a second opinion, and the patient is able to sort of share with the healthcare professional whether they're feeling comfortable, if they'd like to try different options, and if there are options, the professional can let them know about it, and they're able to sort of select how to proceed. In the user agreements, the terms and conditions can actually change. So in a contract of this nature, at the end of the contract, they are able to say something along the lines of, these terms are subject to change without notice. And in actual fact, these contracts now can say they're subject to change with notice, but in many cases, there is so much control over that contract from the side of the business or the company that's providing that technology. Whereas in informed consent, it would be highly, highly unethical to suddenly change the agreed medical intervention. So without an appropriate discussion, without consideration of the customer or the patient's rather, input into that process. So obviously there are conditions of what's called reduced autonomy. So for example, if the patient is under anesthesia, as the healthcare professional, you have an ethical obligation to try and attain consent, if not from the patient, then from the next of kin. But the idea is that as a healthcare professional, your intentions towards the patients are to prioritize their health and their well-being. And you are considerate of their desires and their opinions and comfort level when it comes to those decisions that need to be taken in a medical sense. Whereas in the user agreements, there is this unequal power arrangement where the business is able to take those decisions unilaterally. In terms of the user agreements, the company is able to spell out how they're going to use your data, and they can include protections for the company in terms of various terms across the the agreement documents. The intention of the user agreement is to make the company or the developer feel comfortable. In informed consent, of course, it does offer some protections to the healthcare professional as well. It actually reduces your risk if you've taken that patient through informed consent, and many times it's a written document, even in a clinical setting. Obviously, it's a written document in a research setting and in a, let's say, a database setting where there's like biobanking of tissues and DNA, there is a written consent form. But even in the clinical setting, those forms exist as well. But although that exists and it does protect the provider or protects the organization, the process is not really, it doesn't exist purely to protect the provider. The consent process is about enhancing the autonomy of the patient and giving the patient a voice and the ability to interact in terms of those health decisions. It's really about, although it makes the healthcare provider comfortable, and that's a good thing, it really exists to make the patient comfortable. I find it interesting that in user agreements, there is no dialogue or discussion or interaction of any sort. The person sees the agreements and needs to agree or disagree and go their merry way. But in informed consent, it's about this process of enhanced understanding, education, dialogue, and very key, the ability for the patient to refuse treatment. I just want to say that if the patient cannot refuse treatment, then no consent actually exists. So the idea of consent or refusal is really important to this process of autonomy, because if the patient can't refuse, then they do not in fact have any autonomy in the situation. In terms of patient data, it is really important when we're respecting patient autonomy to keep their data private and to maintain the confidentiality of the patient as much as possible. So ethically speaking, this medical, historical, behavioral, personal, demographic data are always kept private. That is basically one of the most important tenets of healthcare today. In specific circumstances, data can be shared outside of that relationship, particularly when it comes to research. But also in terms of data itself, if data gets shared outside of that relationship, that itself is usually covered by consent as well. So how you use that data, you would discuss that with the patient and say, look, I'd like to share this. And if you're not discussing it with the patient, you would anonymize the details of the patient and then you would discuss it. So one way or another, as a provider, you are always protecting the patient's confidentiality, their privacy, and giving them the ability to consent even when it comes to the use of their data. So outside of just the medical procedures that they're going to have, also the way their information is shared with others or not shared. That is covered through informed consent as well, whereas in user agreements, data sharing is not always covered. I just lastly want to say that I don't wish to overstate the contrast between a user agreement and an informed consent process, in that businesses today, they are incentivized and it is truly within their interest to create products that give customers a great experience. They don't want to create products where customers don't feel secure or they feel taken advantage of and they just feel that the company has too much power. Consumers want to feel that they have power as well. So I do not mean in any way to state that the user agreement is there to diminish and basically create a really negative situation for the customer. Obviously, if the business does that, then they won't have any customers. So it's not quite as black and white as all of that. And also, I've read the terms and conditions around some of these medical apps and chatbots myself. And what I've noticed is that some companies are doing it better than others, but they're taking steps to make those user agreements first and foremost more legible, more comprehensible, because the way that they're laid out, the fonts that are used, the subheadings that are used can all play quite a big role in how easy it is for a person to read that document. Also, what they're doing is that they're becoming way more explicit about how the data that's generated in that app is actually used by the company. So they're explaining who gets the data, how long they can store and keep the data for, how that data is encrypted and secured as well. And as I said, some businesses are doing it better and others are not. But you can see that some of these device companies and chatbot companies and other applications are starting to take steps towards being more mindful of the medical ethics implications of their software, and understanding that a healthcare professional is not going to recommend or work with a business if they are not, let's say, subjugating their needs to some of these important ethical principles. So it is good to see that some of this ethics is filtering in, but I would say that there is still a long way to go, especially in how the document, the agreement, is actually communicated in the front end or in the interface for the user, how that's actually communicated in the front end. Because I do feel that the more that there is a so-called dialogue and the more power and a more of a voice that they give to that patient who they see as a consumer, the more ethical that products can be for healthcare technology. So that actually concludes this section and this contrast between informed consent and user agreements. All in all, that's actually the end of our seminar now on wearables and some of the ethical implications. I trust that you've enjoyed it. I really want to thank you for lending me your time and your attention, And please feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions or thoughts on this. I'd love to hear from you, and take care.